A struggling aide had just been hired to be a maid at the lavish estate of a millionaire. But on her very first day, she heard the muffled weeping of a child coming from inside the mansion. The scorching midday sun of the Palm Springs area bounced off the gilded iron gate, creating blinding streaks that forced Stella to squint. She tightened the strap of her worn imitation leather handbag. The tuition loan notice tucked inside felt searing hot, singeing her thoughts. At 24, a final-year nursing student, Stella knew she had no alternative. She desperately needed this job, the substantial pay promised by the short-term contract, regardless of the rumors about the homeowner's difficult temperament. The heavy automated gates groaned as they parted. A fiery red convertible zipped out of the driveway and onto the main road like an arrow. Behind the wheel was a young woman with silky blonde hair fluttering wildly in the breeze. Veronica wore oversized sunglasses that concealed half her face. Her left hand gripped the steering wheel while her right pressed a phone against her ear. "Exactly, Cabo, I finally made it out of that prison. Don't worry, I gave the housekeeper my instructions. Don't call unless the house is on fire, okay?" Veronica's crisp laugh echoed before being swallowed by the distant roar of the engine. She didn't look back at the mansion once, as if fleeing a plague rather than leaving her own residence. Stella stood rooted to the spot road dust settling on her face. That was her first impression of the stepmother of the house. Martha, the robust housekeeper dressed in a solid black uniform dress, was waiting at the front door. She tossed Stella a neatly folded gray uniform, but the gesture was laden with disdain. "Change. The rules here are simple. You handle the first floor cleaning, I manage the second floor and the kitchen operations. Keep your curiosity to yourself, and most importantly," she yawned widely, glancing at her watch, "don't interrupt my afternoon rest." Before Stella could even nod, Martha turned her back and headed straight toward the staff quarters, the sound of the deadbolt clicking shut cutting through the air. On that first day, Stella distinctly thought she heard a faint whimper or sniffle from somewhere within the house. The next 10 days passed in chilling silence. The massive house resembled an art museum. Everything was stark white, impeccable and cold. Stella polished expensive sculptures and sparkling crystal light fixtures, but she always felt a fundamental element of a family home was missing warmth. With her medical background, Stella quickly noticed the alarming condition of the young lady of the house, Lily. The 6-year-old was like a tiny phantom drifting through her own home. Lily always wore costly designer dresses, yet they hung loosely on her frail frame. Her large, round eyes constantly darted around, and her skin was pale and lifeless. The strangest thing was the massive double-door refrigerator in the kitchen. On her third day, Stella opened it looking for a drink. Inside, there was no fresh milk, no eggs, no meat or fish. The cooling compartment was stocked with gold leaf facial masks, imported spring water, and dozens of expensive bottles of bubbly. There was virtually no real nourishment for a growing child. Stella quietly broke the rules. During Martha's afternoon rest, when the housekeeper was engrossed in her shows, Stella used her spare change to buy a few eggs and some small pasta noodles. She quickly prepared warm bowls of simple homemade soup in a quiet corner of the gas stove. The first time Lily saw the soup, she looked at Stella as if she were a fairy godmother. The little girl devoured it, drinking every last drop, and then quickly helped Stella eliminate the evidence by scrubbing the bowl clean before Martha reappeared. It was their little secret, an invisible bond woven from hunger. But today, Stella hadn't had time to prepare anything. Martha had handed her a lengthy list of outdoor chores, first thing in the morning. When Stella stepped into the kitchen, her stomach rumbling and her back soaked with perspiration, the clock read, well past noon. The room was silent save for the low hum of the central air conditioning unit. A small metallic clink came from the corner where the stainless steel smart trash receptacle stood. Stella narrowed her eyes. She saw a small figure bent over. It was Lily. The little girl was standing on tiptoes, trying to reach deep into the bin. Her bony fingers rummaged through layers of soiled napkins and plastic containers, pulling out something dark. It was the burnt crust of a pizza that Martha had ordered for herself the night before and thrown out the leftovers. The dough was charred black stiff and covered in ashes and dust. Lily didn't hesitate. She brought the refuse to her mouth and took a bite. The dry, brittle crunch of the burnt crust echoed sharply in the still kitchen. She chewed hastily, her eyes darting nervously side to side, exactly like a little mouse sneaking a scrap. Stella's heart sank. She dropped her cleaning cloth on the counter and rushed forward. "Lily, stop!" Lily jumped in surprise. The piece of charred crust dropped from her hand onto the floor. Instinctively, she didn't run away. She shrank back, her arms clutching her head, sinking down into the corner by the refrigerator. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Her voice was shaky, as quiet as a whisper. "I didn't mean to make the floor dirty. Please don't tell Martha. I was so hungry." Stella froze, her hand suspended in the air. The child wasn't afraid of Stella. She was terrified of a much larger, unseen force in this house. Stella knelt gently, pulled Lily's hands from her head, and looked directly into the girl's sunken eyes. "I'm not going to scold you, but that item is unsanitary. You absolutely cannot eat it." "But she said I have to eat before I can go out." Lily mumbled, her eyes still fixated on the piece of charred bread on the floor with visible regret. The door to the staff quarters burst open. Martha emerged, her face flushed from her interrupted rest. She saw Stella kneeling on the floor and Lily huddled in the corner. Without a flicker of confusion, she marched straight to the dry goods pantry and pulled out an old, dented cardboard box. "What is all this commotion? I told you this is my rest period." She tossed the box down in front of Lily. Spilling out were cheap, brightly packaged, spicy snack chips, a few cans of liver pâté with rust forming on the edges, and brightly colored gummy candies. "If you're hungry, eat this. Quick, easy, and saves money on groceries." Martha jutted her chin. "Eat it, and then drink some plain water to fill up. Stop bothering me." Stella stood up, her voice trembling with indignation. "Martha, the young lady, needs a proper meal, or at least warm soup. These are full of strong spices and preservatives." Martha spun around, her eyes sharp as a razor, boring into Stella. "Are you a medical expert, or the help Mrs. Veronica is away, and I am the law here? Do you want your pay so you can settle your debt? If you do, then close your mouth and do your job." The threat struck Stella's vulnerability. She bit her lip, recalling the tuition debt in her mind, then looked at Lily. A bitter wave of helplessness washed over her. Lily, accustomed to the command, quickly picked up a package of the vivid red snacks. She tore the wrapper open with her tiny teeth. The pungent artificial spice odor wafted up to Stella's nose. The 6-year-old tilted the bag, pouring the chips coated heavily in chili powder into her mouth. She chewed greedily, not because it tasted good, but because hunger was tearing at her insides. But only 3 bites and Lily's face changed. It turned from pale to flushed, then suddenly ashen white again. She dropped the snack bag. Both hands clamped tightly around her abdomen. A painful whimper escaped her lips. Lily folded in half like a cooked shrimp, cold sweat instantly beating on her forehead, the sharp irritants reacting violently with her empty stomach. "Ugh," Lily dry heaved. There was nothing to eject but sour stomach acid and the red chip fragments she'd just swallowed. She collapsed onto the floor, her breathing ragged. "Lily." "La!" Stella screamed, forgetting all fear of losing her job. She rushed to cradle the child's head. Martha stood still, a flicker of panic crossing her face, but she quickly forced a rigid demeanor. "She's just being dramatic again. Get up right now." Just then, a sound came from the driveway. The roar of a car engine, followed by a screeching abrupt halt right in front of the main entrance. Stella and Martha both peered out the window. Both were stunned. The iron gate was wide open. A sleek black Maybach had just barreled into the driveway. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his face etched with urgency and fatigue. George had returned. A week earlier than scheduled. The heavy oak front door flew open, letting a rush of hot air from outside into the frigid living room. George walked in quickly, his phone still pressed to his ear, his other hand pulling a suitcase that still bore the International Airport sticker. "Cancel the meeting with the Japanese partners. Tell them my plane was delayed. George said curtly before hanging up. By the kitchen island, Martha started as if jolted by electricity. She quickly used her heel to kick the scattered wrappers of the spicy chips in the cardboard box deep under the counter. Her previously angry expression immediately smoothed out, replaced by her usual practiced professional smile. "Mr. George, why are you home so early? We thought—" George didn't respond. He stopped in the middle of the living room, his nose slightly wrinkled. The usual expensive lemon eucalyptus scent couldn't completely mask a strange new odor today. His gaze swept quickly over the marble floor, then stopped at the sofa. Lily was lying there so small, she was almost swallowed by the huge throw pillows. George rushed to his daughter's side. "Lily!" He placed a hand on her forehead, ice cold. Clammy sweat drenched her, sticking the fine hair to her temples. Lily's breathing was quick and shallow, each inhale seeming like a struggle. Her thin hands were still clamped tightly over her upper abdomen. What in the world is wrong with her? George spun around. Martha quickly squeezed in, obstructing George's view of the kitchen area. "Oh, it's just a child thing, sir. The young lady was running around in the scorching sun outside earlier. She's probably just a bit overheated and tired. I told her to come in and rest, but she insists on playing." George frowned. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Harrison." Hearing the doctor's name, Lily's eyes fluttered open. She caught sight of Martha standing behind her father. The housekeeper glared a sharp, threatening look that only Lily understood. Lily shuddered quickly, grasping the sleeve of her father's suit jacket, shaking her head vigorously. "No, Daddy, don't call the doctor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm fine. I just feel sleepy. Please don't scold Martha." "Biddy." George looked at his daughter, then back at the housekeeper. Something wasn't adding up. He leaned down to pick her up, but his eyes caught a strange item lying exposed beneath the sofa. It was a fragment of a bright red-orange snack wrapper, the cheap kind sold at corner convenience stores, the type that should never be allowed near this family's organic diet. George picked up the wrapper piece. He looked at it, then at Martha. The seed of doubt began to sprout, eroding his long-held blind trust. "Tomorrow." George stood up, his voice chillingly flat. "I want a proper lunch. I will be dining at home." He carried Lily upstairs to her room, leaving the housekeeper standing stunned in the living room. That night, the mansion was shrouded in silence. George tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The image of the candy wrapper in his daughter's ice-cold hand haunted his mind. He got up and walked out into the dark hallway. As he passed Lily's room, he heard a sound. George quickly grabbed the doorknob, twisting it forcefully to enter. Click. The door didn't open. It was secured with a deadbolt from the outside, the dry, cold sound of the lock echoing in the still night. George stood frozen before the thick oak door. "Martha, open this door. Right now." Hurried, heavy footsteps sounded from the staff quarters at the end of the hall. Martha appeared, her nightgown askew, her face drowsy but her eyes wide with alarm when she saw her boss standing at the young lady's door. "Mr. George, what is the matter? It's late." "Why is Lily's door bolted from the outside?" George pointed at the lock. "Who authorized you to shut her in like that?" The housekeeper stammered, wringing the hem of her gown. She glanced at the door, then at George, forcing a strained smile. "You misunderstand, sir. It's because the young lady has been sleepwalking lately. One night I saw her wandering down to the kitchen looking for things. It's too dangerous. I lock it only to protect her." George stared at the housekeeper. The reason sounded plausible, but his business acumen told him something was amiss behind those evasive eyes. He didn't argue, simply lowering his voice in a growl. "Unlock it. And from now on, if I ever see this door locked again, you will pack your belongings." Martha quickly inserted the key, her hand shaking. The door swung open. Inside it was pitch dark and quiet. The earlier sound of whimpering had vanished, replaced by a fabricated sound of steady breathing. Lily was pretending to sleep. George knew it, but he didn't wake her. He stood there for a moment, looking at the small figure curled up under the blanket, then turned and walked back toward his study. He wouldn't sleep tonight. The next morning, the atmosphere in the vast dining room was taut as a guitar string ready to snap. The morning sunlight illuminated the long marble table but failed to dispel the pervasive chill. George sat at the head of the table, a financial newspaper in his hand, but not reading a word. Stella stood discreetly in the corner, holding a water pitcher, not daring to breathe loudly. It was 8 in the morning. Veronica still hadn't returned. Martha emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver tray. She placed an opulent gold-rimmed porcelain bowl in front of George. Inside was steaming white rice porridge garnished with fresh bright green herbs. "Here is your breakfast, sir. Pork rib and lotus seed stew. I woke up at 4 this morning to simmer it." She spoke with a look of dedication, but the fine beads of sweat on her forehead betrayed her extreme anxiety. George looked at the porridge. It smelled savory, but it wasn't the delicate aroma of fresh rice or slow-cooked bone broth. It was pungent, a sharp scent that went straight to his nose, the odor of synthetic flavorings commonly found in instant noodle seasoning packets. He picked up a spoon and stirred gently. George scooped a small spoonful and brought it to his mouth. The harsh saltiness of industrial salt burst onto his tongue, followed by the cloying sweetness of excessive MSG. There was no sweetness from bones, no richness from lotus seeds, only the taste of cheap instant porridge mixed with boiling water. George swallowed hard, feeling as if he'd consumed a handful of sand. He slowly set the spoon down, took his napkin to wipe his mouth, and looked up at Martha, who was standing nervously, awaiting praise. "You simmered this since 4 this morning." "Yes, sir. I selected the finest young pork ribs." "The finest?" George jumped to his feet. His arm swung up forcefully. Crash. The expensive porcelain bowl flew off the table, smashing loudly against the stone floor. The thick white porridge splattered everywhere, covering George's polished leather shoes and the hem of the housekeeper's dress. "Do you take me for a fool?" George roared, his voice echoing through the house. "This is instant rice, the cheap kind sold at the convenience store. You feed me this garbage, so what has my daughter been eating daily, huh?" Martha recoiled, her face draining of color. She stammered, attempting to explain when the front door burst open. "Hola, I'm home. Oh, I missed this place so much." Veronica swept in like a whirlwind of color. She dragged a massive Louis Vuitton suitcase into the house, still wearing her boldly slit beach maxi dress, a wide-brimmed hat, and sporting a deep tan from days soaking up the sun in Cabo. Veronica removed her sunglasses and rushed to embrace George, the heavy scent of Chanel perfume overwhelming the smell of the spilled porridge. "Darling, why are you back so soon?" I rushed straight here the moment my flight landed. That charity trip was exhausting. I didn't even have time to change. George gently detached his wife's hands, his cold gaze sweeping over her from head to toe. Charity on which beach made your skin that deep bronze? And what kind of charity involves a suitcase still sporting the luggage tags for a leisure vacation? The smile froze on Veronica's face. She quickly averted her eyes, shifting immediately into a spoiled, pleading mode. "Well, I combined a little relaxation after all that hard work, didn't I?" "Oh, you're so grumpy right after coming home? Let me order some food, shall we? We should celebrate your return with a feast for lunch. I know a new seafood place that's just amazing." Without waiting for George's agreement, Veronica pulled out her phone rapidly, dialing intentionally, ignoring the mess on the floor and the housekeeper's distressed face. She needed to cover up her absence with a party. It was the only solution she knew spend money. An hour later, the dining table had been cleaned and replaced with towering stacks of delivered food-fried lobster with garlic butter, spicy lamb curry. Everything was rich, oily, intensely seasoned, and vibrant red. The smell of frying oil and chili powder permeated the air. George sat down in the host chair. Lily was led out from the bedroom by Stella. The little girl wore a white dress, her pale face contrasting completely with the feast's exuberance. Lily looked at the dishes, her eyes showing an instinctive fear. "Sit down, sweetheart," George said, his voice softening slightly. "Your mother Veronica prepared a lavish lunch for the family." Veronica heartily scooped a large piece of fried shrimp drenched in garlic butter sauce into Lily's bowl. "Eat up, sweetie. This is very expensive, full of good nutrition. You're too thin. You need to eat plenty to fatten up." Lily looked at the shrimp. The smell of garlic and grease wafted up, causing her sensitive stomach to clench slightly. She looked up at George, then secretly glanced at Stella standing in the corner. Stella wanted to rush over and intervene. She subtly shook her head to signal no, but Veronica's sharp glare made her hesitate. "Eat, Lily." George urged a touch of pressure in his voice from expectation. He wanted to believe everything was fine, that this meal would mend his suspicions. "Don't make your mother sad." Lily picked up her fork. Her hand trembled. She didn't want to disappoint her father. She was afraid Martha would scold her after her father left. She was afraid Veronica would call her ungrateful. Lily speared the shrimp piece and brought it to her mouth. The richness of the butter and the sharp spice of the garlic and chili immediately assaulted her palate. She closed her eyes, trying to chew and swallow. The food went down her esophagus like a burning ember. The moment it reached her stomach, Lily's body reacted violently. She dropped her fork. Clang! Her small hands clutched her abdomen. Lily's face went from stark white to blue-tinged. She gasped, trying to breathe but couldn't. "Ugh! Daddy!" Before she could finish the word, Lily folded over. A torrent of liquid erupted from her mouth. Lily began to vomit violently right onto the lavish feast table. The bile and the just-swallowed food spattered onto the pristine white tablecloth and even stained the sleeve of George's shirt. "Oh my God, that is disgusting!" Veronica shrieked, jumping out of her chair, frantically brushing at her expensive maxi dress. George didn't care about the stains. He stared horrified at his daughter. After vomiting, Lily went limp. Her eyes rolled back slightly and her body slid from the chair, collapsing onto the cold floor. "Lily!" George yelled, overturning his chair as he rushed to his child. Lily's body was slack in George's arms, heartbreakingly light. Her head lolled to the side, her skin as white as paper. Her breathing was ragged, weak, and intermittent like a sputtering flame. "Get the car, open the door!" George roared like a wounded animal, cradling his daughter as he ran frantically toward the front door. He didn't wait for his personal driver. He didn't wait for anyone. Stella dashed right behind him, quickly grabbing a bath towel to wrap Lily. Veronica and Martha stood frozen in the dining room. Veronica's shouts about the soiled rug still echoed, but George had already left it all behind. He flung open the door of the black SUV, placing Lily lengthwise on the back seat. "Stella, get in and hold her. Keep her head elevated." Stella scrambled into the car, holding Lily's head on her lap. Her hands trembled as she rubbed the child's chest, murmuring prayers. George jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. The roar of the V8 engine tore through the quiet of the affluent neighborhood. On the crowded Interstate 10 in Los Angeles, George drove like a maniac. He blared the horn, constantly weaving through the endless stream of traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, every vein visible. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his mind was filled only with the sight of his daughter's vomit. "I'm sorry. Hang in there, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." George mumbled, his voice cracked. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a wave of fear that he might lose her right now. Stella sat in the back, tears streaming down onto Lily's gaunt face. She felt the child's body temperature dropping. "Sir, hurry, her pulse is very weak." The SUV skidded to a stop in front of the emergency entrance of St. Jude Private Hospital. George didn't wait for staff to open the door. He carried Lily inside, yelling for a doctor. Nurses immediately rushed a gurney over, received Lily, and pushed her rapidly down the white hallway. The cold neon lights shone directly onto his daughter's face, forcing George to see the stark truth he had ignored for too long. Her prominent cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and the faint bruised marks on her skinny arms. The emergency room doors slammed shut in front of him. George stood there, panting, his arms hanging limp. His designer white shirt was stained with his daughter's vomit, but he didn't bother to wipe it off. 30 minutes stretched into an eternity. The door opened. The head of pediatrics. An older man with gray hair and thick glasses stepped out. He didn't immediately remove his mask, but looked at George with a narrowed gaze full of suppressed outrage. In his hand was the stack of freshly printed medical records. "Who is the father of this child?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I am." George stepped forward. "How is my daughter, doctor?" The physician removed his mask, threw the file onto the nearby nurse's desk with a sharp thud, and yelled right into George's face. "How in the world are you raising this child?" George was stunned. "Excuse me. Acute stomach ulcers layered upon chronic malnutrition," the doctor stated, articulating every word, pointing a finger at the lab results sheet. "Her stomach lining is severely inflamed and shows multiple layers of old and recent ulcerations. Do you know what we found in her stomach fluid?" He didn't wait for George to answer. "High concentration acids, sodium levels 10 times the acceptable threshold, preservatives, industrial food dyes, and undigested pieces of hard processed food." The doctor looked straight into George's eyes. "That was not healthy food. Her stomach is paper thin from being worn down by hot spices and chemicals for a prolonged period. If you had arrived 15 minutes later, this little girl might not have made it." George stood paralyzed. His ears rang. The doctor's words were like sledgehammer blows shattering his arrogance. The glamorous image of a billionaire father vanished, leaving only the stark reality of an invisible crime that had been taking place right inside his golden fortress. "Look," the doctor pointed to Stella, who was quietly weeping in the corner. "This young woman says the child just ate one piece of fried shrimp, but that stomach has been devastated for months. A 6-year-old child cannot buy food like that herself." Just then, the sound of high heels clacking on the tile floor echoed. Veronica and Martha rushed toward them, breathless. Veronica had managed to change into another dress, but the heavy perfume still overpowered the hospital's antiseptic smell. Martha trailed behind her eyes, nervously seeking an exit. "Oh, George, how is she, honey?" Veronica rushed up, trying to grab her husband's arm, her familiar whiny tone returning. "I was so scared, I've been crying in the car." George didn't turn around. He stood rigid as a stone statue. "Is she stable, darling? It must be the restaurant's unsanitary shrimp. I'm going to sue them." Veronica's words were cut short. George slowly turned his head. The look in his eyes held no trace of affection, sharp as a razor containing the deepest disgust. Veronica halted, her hand suspended in the air. She had never seen her husband with such a terrifying expression. George didn't yell. He walked slowly toward the two women. His silence overwhelmed the space, making Martha tremble and retreat backward. He pulled out his phone, his finger scrolling quickly across the screen, sending a brief text to his security chief seal off all entry and exit points at the estate. "No one is allowed to take anything out." Putting his phone away, George walked past Veronica as if she didn't exist. He went straight to Stella, grasping her arm and pulling her decisively toward the emergency stairwell. "Come with me," he said, his voice deep and hoarse. "Go. Go where, sir?" Stella was bewildered. "Be quiet and walk." George gritted his teeth, his eyes fixed forward. He left the two culprits standing stunned and shaking in the cold hospital hallway, beginning his journey to seek justice for his daughter. George dragged Stella through the long hospital corridor, past nurses pushing supply carts and weary family members slumped in chairs. He pushed open the heavy fire door leading to the emergency stairwell. The door slammed shut behind them with a dry thud, cutting off all the hospital noise, leaving only the cold silence of the gray concrete space. George released Stella's arm. The young woman backed up until her back hit the cold wall, her hands clasped together and trembling. She had never seen her boss in this state. Gone was the usual polite, distant demeanor. George now resembled a volcano suppressing a deep-seated eruption. "Talk?" George's voice echoed deep and dull against the four narrow walls. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes stared into the void as if trying to reassemble the shattered worldview he'd just received. Stella hesitated, her throat dry. George snapped his head around, looking directly into her eyes. That gaze held the threat of a powerful man, but Deep inside was the desperate plea of a father who had just realized his catastrophic failure. "I am not paying you to lie. I need to know everything that happened in that house when I boarded the plane. Don't hide even a tiny detail. If you lie, I swear you will never find another job in this city." Stella took a deep breath. She looked at the stains on George's shirt, remembering Lily's painfully light body in his arms earlier. Her fear of the boss vanished, replaced by the long-suppressed indignation she felt for the child. "You want the truth?" Stella asked back, her voice shaky but clear. "The truth is you don't have a family, Mr. George. You just have a boarding house for strangers." George frowned, but he didn't interrupt. "The day I arrived for the job, Mrs. Veronica immediately left with her suitcase. She didn't go for charity. She told Martha she was going to Cabo with friends and instructed the housekeeper not to call unless the house was on fire." George gripped the iron railing of the staircase. The cold paint dug into his palm. "And Martha? She was the law of the house when you were absent." Stella continued, the words spilling out faster. "She didn't go grocery shopping. She ordered pizza for herself and threw the charred crust to Lily. She said shopping was expensive and time-consuming. She bought boxes of cheap spicy snacks, the kind sold in bulk at discount markets, and forced the young lady to eat them instead of lunch. She said children love junk food. It's quick and easy." "Spicy snacks," George muttered, recalling the orange wrapper fragment under the sofa. "Exactly. And near-expired canned goods. And uncooked instant noodles. Anything that didn't require cooking. She insisted the young lady eat quickly and return to her room so Martha could take her rest or watch her shows. Why didn't Lily call me? Why didn't she say anything? Because she was scared." Stella looked straight at George. "Martha threatened that if the young lady told on her, she would fire me, the only person who was secretly giving the child a piece of bread, and more importantly, the young lady was afraid of upsetting you. She thought if she was good, if she didn't cause trouble, you would come home sooner." George closed his eyes. A sharp pain shot through his chest, more severe than any physical wound. He had thought he was the hero providing a life of comfort for his child. Instead, he was just a generous sponsor who threw money at problems. He signed massive checks for groceries and fake charity trips, and in return, his daughter had no proper food to eat. And the door, George opened his eyes. Why was it locked? That was Martha's rule. Discipline time. She locked the young lady in to ensure she didn't run around, mess up the house, or disturb her. Some days, the young lady was locked in from noon until late evening without water, only a package of spicy chips. Silence enveloped them. Only George's heavy, labored breathing filled the space. He released the railing. "Let's go." "Go where's her home?" George didn't wait for Stella's reply. He turned, pushing the door open. This time he didn't walk. He ran. He pulled Stella's arm, dragging her across the large parking lot. He pushed her into the passenger seat of the SUV, slammed the door shut, and jumped into the driver's seat. The car roared to life, shooting out of the hospital gates, merging into the late-night traffic of the city. George drove like a madman, but this time it wasn't panic. It was a clear purpose. He needed proof. He needed to see the hell he had inadvertently created for his daughter with his own eyes. 20 minutes later, the car skidded to a stop in front of the mansion gates. The house was plunged in darkness. No lights were on, though the garden lights should have been illuminated by now. The mansion looked like a giant sleeping monster, swallowing all the life within. George stepped out of the car. He turned on his phone's flashlight. The blue-white light swept across the cluttered living room where the remnants of the lunch party were still visible. Cold, uneaten dishes, dried vomit on the floor. He stepped past them, heading straight up the stairs. The sound of his leather shoes hitting the wooden steps echoed through the empty house. Second floor. The long, silent hallway led to the last room. George stopped outside Lily's door. The oak door was tightly closed. He reached for the knob. Even with Lily in the emergency room, even with the room empty, Martha had locked the door out of habit. Or was she locking it to conceal what was inside? George felt the blood rush to his face. That ridiculous darn rule. That ridiculous darn discipline. He took a step back. He didn't look for a spare key. He didn't want to use her key. He wanted to break it. George mustered all his strength, delivering a powerful kick right at the lock mechanism. Crack. The door rattled but didn't burst open. The oak was too thick. George gritted his teeth, stepped back further, took a running start, and kicked again. This time, he poured all his fury, all his pain and regret into the strike. Snap. The sharp sound of wood splintering tore through the still night. The door frame shattered. The door flew open, slamming against the inside wall with a chilling sound that shook the silent hallway. George stepped inside. An odor hit him immediately. Not the smell of lavender or sweet orange oil. It was the smell of damp mildew, and hidden within that the sour stench of forgotten decaying food. Was this the room of a little princess? He swept his flashlight around. Everything looked artificially neat. The bedspread was smooth. Toys were stacked in a glass cabinet. But as the light scanned closer, he saw the thick layer of dust on the bookshelf. He saw the bedsheets, though flat, were stained and wrinkled in the corner, looking as though they hadn't been changed in weeks. "Where?" George asked, his voice strained. Stella stood at the broken doorway, her hands covering her mouth, silent tears streaming down her face. She knew this moment would change everything. This box was the silent witness to the long nights Lily had endured alone. George walked over. He didn't care about soiling his expensive suit. He knelt down on the hard wooden floor. He lowered himself, shining the flashlight into the darkness under the bed, preparing to confront the most brutal truth of his life. George's flashlight beam cut through the thick dust under the bed, illuminating an object deep in the furthest corner against the wall. It was a round tin cookie box, the kind from decades ago. The paint on the outside was peeling and chipped rust corroding the edges. It lay there lonely and cold like a deserted island in a sea of dust. George reached in. His fingers brushed against the cold, rough metal surface. He grabbed the edge of the box and pulled it out. The sound of metal scraping against the wooden floor was a grating screech like fingernails on a chalkboard. He placed the box in the middle of the room right under the flashlight beam. It was heavy, much heavier than an empty box or one filled with a few plastic toys. That unusual weight tightened George's chest. He instinctively knew what he was about to see was anything but simple. Stella stood leaning against the broken door frame, her hands still covering her mouth, tears flowing freely. She knew this box was the silent testament to Lily's suffering. George took a deep breath, trying to steady his trembling hands. He placed his finger in the seam of the lid and forced it open. Click. The lid sprang off. A pungent, spoiled odor wafted up, hitting him directly in the face. George quickly tipped the box upside down onto the expensive Persian rug. Rustle. A cascade of refuse tumbled out. George was stunned. He braced himself with both hands on the floor, his eyes wide, refusing to believe what he was seeing. Scattered across the rug were hundreds of candy wrappers in green, red, purple, and yellow. Snack chip bags were torn open, still containing fragments of red chili powder and grease, gnawed pieces of raw instant noodle wrappers, empty tubes of cheap processed sausages, and most horrifyingly rolling among the plastic detritus were pieces of bread now green and red with mold hard as rock. A piece of charred pizza crust remained. Half-eaten apples had spoiled, shriveling into a grayish-brown color. George picked up an empty snack bag, the super spicy kind, costing only a few pennies per package, the kind he had never allowed in the house for health reasons. Yet here were dozens, hundreds of wrappers. "Is this my daughter's meal?" George whispered, his voice cracking. He continued to sift through the rubbish. His hand touched some crumpled, rolled-up pieces of paper stuffed into the bottom of the box. He smoothed one out. It was a childish crayon drawing. The shaky but haunting lines depicted a giant monster wearing a solid black dress exactly like Martha's uniform. The monster had a mouth stretched wide, about to swallow a pile of chicken drumsticks and pastries. In the corner of the picture was a tiny little girl, just stick figures put together, huddled fearfully. Her stomach was colored bright red with crayon, the frantic cross-hatching symbolizing intense pain. Beside the little girl was a misspelled line. "Daddy, I'm hungry. My tummy hurts." A wave of nausea rose in his throat. He picked up another item. It was an old hand-torn calendar page. On it, Lily had used a red marker to circle the days of the month, many red circles. Beside each circle was a symbol, an empty bowl. George flipped the calendar to check the dates. These were the days Veronica had told him she was away for charity business trips or conferences. The days he had transferred money into her account for family care. On those days, his daughter had marked her calendar with the symbol of hunger. He dropped the calendar. His hands trembled so violently he couldn't control them. He tried to stand, but his legs disobeyed. He staggered, then collapsed back down. This wasn't just trash. This was undeniable evidence of an invisible crime, more brutal than any physical blow. His daughter had been forced to live like a mouse, scavenging every scrap for survival, hiding them in this box like a treasure, while he was busy making money in faraway places to build what he called her future. What future was there when his child was wasting away from hunger in the present? The regret and anguish in George slowly transformed. It solidified, heating up. It became a tremendous explosion of fury. His jaw clenched, grinding his teeth, until he heard a faint clattering sound. "You people!" George roared, a gut-wrenching cry of pain. He frantically gathered all the trash, the moldy bread, the drawings, the old calendar, stuffing them violently into a large black garbage bag he found in the corner receptacle. He stuffed them in handful after handful, as if trying to collect all his daughter's pain into the bag. Stella recoiled in fear at the sight of her boss. That was no longer the face of a polite businessman. It was the face of a father seeking justice, cold and ruthless. George tied the mouth of the bag securely. He stood up. This time he stood tall. He straightened the collar of his shirt despite its crumpled state and stains. He lifted the bag, gripping the handle tightly like a weapon. "Go," he said curtly. George walked out of the room, not bothering to look back. The sound of his footsteps pounded down the wooden staircase, each step an executioner's gavel. He walked straight out the front door, heading toward the garage. He was returning to the hospital. He would bring this bag of trash and place it directly in front of those two women. And tonight there would be a painful reckoning, but the tears shed would no longer be his daughter's. George stepped out of the car at the emergency entrance, clutching the bulging black garbage bag. The sound of the car door slamming shut behind him felt like the final period on his old life. He walked. Each step on the hospital floor was sharp, steady, and cold, like the pounding of a judge's gavel before sentencing. The waiting area for VIP patients was quiet. Dim yellow light shone on the luxurious leather chairs where the two women were sitting. Veronica was glued to her phone screen, her thumb scrolling incessantly through her banking app. She frowned, agitated, not because of her stepdaughter in the emergency room, but because of the transaction denial notification that had just popped up when she tried to order a new designer handbag to de-stress. "Why is the system glitching now? How frustrating," Veronica muttered irritably, tapping her elaborately manicured nails on the screen. Sitting one seat away, Martha was restless. She wasn't using her phone. Her narrow eyes constantly darted from the front door to the side door, then to the wall clock. She was calculating whether she could sneak out, grab a taxi, and disappear before George returned. Before she could finish her escape plan, George's shadow fell upon them. Both women started looking up. George stood there, tall, dusty, but radiating suffocating pressure. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how they were. He swung his arm. The black plastic bag was inverted. A chaotic mess spilled out right onto the gleaming glass coffee table. Hundreds of red and blue candy wrappers, greasy, spicy chip bags, gnawed raw instant noodle wrappers, and chunks of moldy bread in shades of green and red rolled around, making a sickening clatter. A rotting apple core rolled off the table, hitting Veronica's foot. "Ah!" Veronica shrieked, jumping up from the chair as if burned. She frantically brushed off the hem of her dress, her face contorted in disgust. "What in the world are you doing, George? You ruined my dress. Where did you bring this garbage from?" Martha didn't scream. Her mouth dropped open, her face utterly white. She recognized the familiar tin box lying scattered among the trash. She trembled, shrinking back deep into her chair, wishing she could vanish at that moment. George didn't look at Veronica. He leaned both hands on the edge of the table, thrusting his face close to the housekeeper's, his voice low and cold as ice. "This was my daughter's dinner. Look at it closely." He picked up an empty snack bag, holding it in front of Veronica. "You said you were doing charity. You said you were taking care of the family. Do you know how many of these bags the child ate in the week you were gone? 12 bags. 12 bags of chili powder and chemicals replacing 12 meals." Veronica backed away, waving her hands. How should I know? I delegated the duty to Martha. I gave her the money. I gave specific instructions. Maybe the child just likes junk food. All kids do. Pa likes junk food. George gave a humorless laugh that sent chills down their spines. She drew pictures of her stomach hurting every day. She marked the calendar for the days you were away with the symbol of an empty bowl. You call that enjoyment? He turned to Martha. The housekeeper was clasping her hands, mumbling nonsensical prayers. George pulled out a folded stack of A4 paper from his suit pocket. It was the bank statement his assistant had urgently emailed him, which he'd had a nurse print out. He slammed the papers down on the table, covering the pile of wrappers. The lines were highlighted densely in red marker. $5,000, George said, his voice clipped. Every month I transferred $5,000 into the supplementary account for groceries. I wanted my daughter to eat Norwegian salmon, Wagyu beef, and organic vegetables. But look here. He pointed his finger at the paper. No clean food markets were used, only cash withdrawals at the ATM, and transfers to a personal account named Carl. Carl is your son, isn't he, Martha? The one with the gambling addiction you cried about needing money for 2 years ago. Martha knew she couldn't deny it anymore. Her facade of 10 years of dedication was torn away. She slid from the chair, falling to her knees on the cold tile floor, clutching George's trouser leg. "Mr. George, please forgive me. I made a mistake. Carl was being threatened by loan sharks. I was desperate and made a bad choice. I swear I still fed the young lady. I didn't let her starve." "What did you feed her?" George kicked away the instant noodle wrapper at his feet. "Raw noodles, expired canned goods. You stole money meant for my daughter's life to support your son's bad habits." Veronica saw the shift in momentum. Martha was the perfect scapegoat. She immediately regained her sharp demeanor, pointing a finger at the kneeling housekeeper. "You rotten woman, you dared to deceive me. I trusted you, gave you control over the household shopping, and you had the audacity to steal my husband's money and starve my stepdaughter, George. See, I'm a victim too. I've been misled by this old woman all this time." Veronica turned to George, tears welling up, trying to play the innocent wife. "You must believe me. I didn't know anything. I was just too busy with social commitments and neglected my duties. I'll fire her immediately. We'll sue her." George stood up straight. He looked at Veronica, who was trying to cling to his sleeve. He looked at Martha, weeping at his feet. An overwhelming revulsion surged in his throat. Enough. 2 simple words, but their weight silenced the entire room. "Veronica, do you think I'm an idiot? $5,000 a month vanished, and you didn't notice the refrigerator was empty and you didn't check. You are not a victim. You are an accomplice. Your negligence was the license for her to run rampant." He shook Veronica's hand off. "And stop acting. Your credit card isn't glitching. I locked it." Veronica's face went white. That was the crushing blow. To her, losing money was worse than losing a husband. George didn't want to hear any more excuses. The presence of these 2 women here polluted the air where his daughter lay. He raised his hand, gesturing toward the door. 2 large security guards wearing hospital security uniforms had been waiting nearby as requested by George. They approached, their faces grim. "Please exit the premises, ladies. This is a quiet area." "No, you can't do this. I am your wife," Veronica screamed, trying to hold onto the chair. "George, you're losing your mind." "Mr. George, please forgive me. I know I was wrong." Martha wailed, tears and snot streaming down her face. The two security guards showed no mercy. They grabbed the two women by the arms, forcefully escorting them out of the waiting area. Veronica's shouts and Martha's pleas echoed, fading quickly behind the automatic glass doors. The waiting area returned to silence. George stood alone amid the scattered wrappers and refuse on the coffee table. He adjusted his collar, took a deep breath, trying to clear the stench of dishonesty that had just clung to him. The quiet was short-lived. A middle-aged man in a gray suit carrying a briefcase quickly entered the area. It was George's private attorney. He nodded a greeting to George without unnecessary small talk and placed his briefcase on a clean, empty table. "Everything is ready as per your instructions over the phone, Mr. George." The attorney pulled out 2 sets of documents, one thin, one thick. He handed George a fountain pen. "This is the petition for unilateral divorce. Reason gross neglect leading to severe health and emotional consequences. With the medical evidence from the hospital and the bank statements, she will have no claim to marital assets derived from your separate funds." George took the pen. He didn't hesitate, didn't read it again. His penmanship was swift and decisive across the bottom line. The sharp scratch of the nib on the paper sounded like a surgical cut, severing a tumor that had been rooted for too long. "Deliver this to her first thing tomorrow morning and cut off all supplementary allowances, reclaim the car, and revoke all club memberships. I want her to exit my life exactly as she entered it, with nothing." "Understood." The attorney tucked the divorce papers away, then pointed to the thicker file. "And this is the file for criminal charges against Martha. Economic crimes and local police have accepted the report, with embezzlement totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, plus the charge of endangerment of a minor. She faces a minimum of 10 years in prison." "Ensure she is not granted bail," George said, staring into the distance, "and make sure her son is also investigated for receiving proceeds from a crime. I will handle everything. You should go be with your daughter." The attorney bowed and left, carrying away all the legal burdens, leaving George completely free of toxic ties. Having dealt with the rubbish outside, George felt a physical lightness on his shoulders, yet his chest felt heavy. He turned and walked slowly toward patient room 305. He paused at the door, placing his hand on the knob. This time, the door was unlocked. There would never be a locked door facing his daughter again. George gently pushed the door open and stepped in. The VIP hospital room was spacious and absolutely silent. The curtains were drawn, allowing only a faint sliver of yellow streetlight from outside. The space was heavy with the smell of disinfectant and the lilies the hospital provided, but to George, it smelled of safety. Lily was small in the white bed. Her tiny body seemed swallowed by the thick blankets. An IV line was taped to her thin hand, secured with multiple pieces of adhesive. A heart monitor next to the bed emitted a steady, monotonous beep. Beep. George approached. The sturdy legs of the man who had conquered the business world suddenly trembled. He had to brace himself against the bedside rail to stand steady. He looked at his child. Lily was sleeping, or perhaps sedated. Her face was still pale, her lips cracked, but at least her brow was relaxed, no longer furrowed in pain, as it had been at noon. George pulled the padded chair close to the bed. He slumped into it, completely shedding his earlier strong, cold exterior. His shoulders sagged. He extended his large, rough hand, gently enveloping his daughter's small, cold one, careful not to touch the needle. "Lily," George whispered, his voice broken. There was no reply, only the soft whirring of the machines. George pressed her hand against his cheek. The coldness from her skin transferred to him, making him shiver. But that coldness woke up the father within him that had slept for too long. "I was wrong. I'm so sorry, sweetheart." A hot tear rolled from the corner of George's eye, tracing down his nose and dropping onto his daughter's hand. Then, a second, and a third. The man who never cried in front of staff, who never yielded to rivals, was now weeping uncontrollably like a child in the darkness. He cried for his foolishness. He cried for the missed meals. He cried for the spicy chip bags he had unintentionally forced his child to eat through his own indifference. Lily stirred slightly. The tiny hand in George's grip moved weakly. George held his breath, looking up. Lily wasn't fully awake, her eyes still closed, but her little pinky finger instinctively fumbled, hooking gently around George's thumb. A weak grasp, but one that contained absolute trust. George gently squeezed her hand, bowing his head to kiss those frail fingers. Tonight the storm outside had passed. The strangers had been chased from the house. In this room only a father and daughter remained, and from the ashes of destruction a seed of true connection was beginning to sprout. George knew the road ahead was long. He would have to learn how to be a father from scratch, starting with how to prepare a bowl of soup. But he would never let go of her hand again. The morning sun of Los Angeles streamed through the large windows, dancing on the marble countertop of the huge kitchen. A month ago, this place was as cold as a storage unit, where spicy chip bags were tossed onto the floor instead of lunch. But today the air in the kitchen was thick with the aroma of sautéed onions, the sweetness of carrots, and the warmth from a pot of broth simmering gently on the stove. George stood before the island, his hands braced on the counter, his forehead dotted with sweat. The man who had signed multi-million-dollar contracts without a tremor in his hand was now staring intently at an orange carrot with a look of extreme concentration. He was wearing a blue apron with a small bear printed on it, a gift Lily had chosen for him on her discharge day. "Dice cut," George mumbled, repeating the lesson like a slow-witted student. "Not slice, dice." He picked up the knife. His hand was stiff. He brought the knife down, making one cut. A large, misshapen piece of carrot fell away. "Not good." George sighed, his shoulders drooping in disappointment. "It looks more like a rock than a dice. Lily might choke on it." Stella stood nearby, chopping herbs and observing her boss. She couldn't help but smile, a soft, comfortable smile devoid of the reserved fear of her first day. "You're gripping the knife too hard. Loosen your wrist a bit." Stella moved closer. She didn't hesitate to take George's large hand, adjusting his grip on the handle. "Don't use the strength of your whole arm. Use the sharpness of the blade. Like this. Just slide the knife down gently, don't press hard." George followed her instruction. This time the blade slid over the carrot more smoothly. A small square piece of carrot fell onto the cutting board. "There it is," George exclaimed, his eyes shining as if he'd won the lottery. "See, Stella, it's square." "Perfect," Stella nodded in encouragement. "Now you only need to do that for the other 3 carrots." George chuckled, returning to his task. The rhythmic clatter of knife on board filled the air. He had never imagined that cooking required so much effort and concentration. But strangely, he didn't feel tired. Each cut, each seasoning adjustment brought him a sense of peace he had never found in air-conditioned boardrooms. The chicken soup on the stove began to boil vigorously. George lifted the lid. A plume of white steam rose, carrying a wonderful aroma throughout the house. It was the smell of healing. "It's time." George looked at the wall clock. "Is she up?" The young lady woke up the moment she smelled the sautéed onions. "She's drawing in the living room." George turned off the stove. He carefully ladled the soup into a plain white porcelain bowl, this time not the flashy gold-rimmed kind Martha used. He scooped deliberately, ensuring there were enough shredded chicken pieces, diced carrots, and soft noodles. He carried the bowl to the dining room. Stella followed with a tray of orange juice. Lily was sitting at the table. She had gained 5 pounds. Her cheeks were slightly filled out and rosy, though her eyes were still large for her face. Seeing her father emerge in the bare apron, Lily covered her mouth, giggling. "You look silly, Daddy." "Chef George is here to serve his esteemed guest." George bowed in a courtly manner, placing the soup bowl in front of his daughter. "Special chicken and vegetable stew. No spice, no preservatives, and absolutely no plastic wrappers." Lily picked up her spoon. She inhaled the scent. "It smells wonderful, Daddy." "Try it. Be careful, it's hot." George pulled up a chair next to her, resting his chin on his hand to watch. His heart was pounding harder than when he waited for a partner to sign a contract. He worried she wouldn't like it. He worried the seasoning was wrong. He worried his daughter's sensitive stomach would react. Lily scooped a spoonful of soup, blew on it, and put it in her mouth. George held his breath. Stella, standing nearby, also held her breath. Lily chewed gently, then swallowed. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them wide, looking at her father. "It's delicious, Daddy." "Really, your stomach doesn't hurt," George pressed. "No, sir." Lily shook her head, taking a second spoonful. "It's so warm. It goes into my tummy without hurting me. It feels like you're hugging me." The innocent words of the 6-year-old stung George's eyes. He quickly turned away, pretending to cough lightly to conceal his emotion. How many meals like this had he missed? How many opportunities had he missed to hug his child with a warm bowl of soup? "Slow down, sweetie." George reached out to stroke his daughter's hair. "There's plenty more. I cooked a huge pot. Tomorrow I'll make something else." Stella suggested soft tacos. "Would you like that?" "Yes, but you have to promise you'll cook them, Daddy. No ordering from restaurants." "I promise. From now on, I will cook dinner. Unless I burn it too badly, then we'll order pizza, but I'll try not to burn anything." All three burst into laughter. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged dining room, chasing away the shadows of the past. The cold, suffocating atmosphere of earlier days had completely vanished. Stella looked at the father and daughter, her heart warming. She was about to retreat to the kitchen to clean up and give them privacy, when George called her back. "Stella, hold on. Sit down here." "Sir, but I need to clean—" "Leave it. I'll clean it later. Sit down here." George pointed to the chair opposite. "I want to discuss something with you. An idea that popped into my head when I was dicing that misshapen carrot." Stella hesitantly sat down. George looked at her, then at Lily, who was happily eating. His expression became serious but filled with enthusiasm. "You know, Stella, I realized I'm not the only parent who made this mistake. In this city and across this country, there are thousands of children just like Lily. Their parents aren't poor in money, but poor in time. They think hiring expensive help solves their responsibility. They turn their children into orphans in their own homes." George clenched his fist on the table. "I want to change that. I can't fix the past, but I can influence the future. I want to launch a community project, a place to teach busy mothers and fathers how to get back into the kitchen, how to prepare a simple, nutritious meal, how to connect with their children over the dinner table." Stella's eyes widened. "That's a wonderful idea, sir. But you are so busy." "I will be less busy. I've delegated some of my work at the corporation." George smiled. "But I need a manager. Someone who understands the value of a family meal better than anyone. Someone with a heart big enough to care for children who aren't their own." He looked straight into Stella's eyes. "Will you be the project manager? I will handle the finance and the real estate. You handle the content and the people. You will no longer be the help. You will be the inspiration." Stella was stunned. She looked over at Lily. The little girl stopped eating, her mouth smeared with soup, nodding enthusiastically. "You should do it, Stella. You're the best cook ever." Tears welled up in Stella's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. George smiled, the smile of a man who had just found his true life's mission. The chicken soup on the table was still steaming, but its warmth seemed to radiate far beyond the four walls of the kitchen. 6 months later. The large auditorium of the Los Angeles Cultural Center was packed. Hundreds of camera flashes from reporters blinked constantly like a meteor shower. The atmosphere was loud and bustling, but filled with anticipation. The audience below included not only George's business partners, but also mostly young families, fathers in suits who had rushed from work, mothers with small children in tow. Backstage, George was adjusting the bow tie on Lily's dress. Today, the little girl wore a pristine white dress, her hair neatly braided. Lily had grown noticeably taller. Her cheeks were plump and rosy, and her bright eyes showed no trace of fear or illness. "Are you nervous?" George asked, his hands slightly shaking as he fastened her button. "No, sir." Lily shook her head, gripping her father's hand. "Are you shaking, Daddy? Your hand is cold." George gave a strained laugh. "I'm a little nervous. Standing before the board of directors isn't as scary as standing before this crowd." "Don't be scared, Daddy." Lily stood on her toes, whispering the mantra he often told her. "Just breathe deep and think of the smell of chicken soup." George laughed, bending down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart. Let's go. Everyone is waiting." The father and daughter walked onto the stage. The applause roared like thunder. George led Lily to the center of the podium. He looked down at the crowd, taking a deep breath, letting the blinding stage lights wash over him. He wasn't holding a prepared speech. He held the microphone, looking straight into the live camera lens. "Hello, everyone. I am George, a businessman. But today I stand here not to talk about real estate or stocks. I stand here as a father who once failed." The entire hall fell silent. 6 months ago, my daughter Lily was admitted to the emergency room. George looked down at his daughter, his gaze gentle. She suffered from malnutrition and severe stomach ulcers, not because I was poor, but because I was too rich. I was rich in money, but poor in attention. I let strangers into my home, entrusted my child to them, and thought money could buy security. He paused, his voice choked, but firm. I was wrong. Money can buy a house, but not a home. Money can buy fine food, but not the joy of eating. My daughter was forced to eat garbage wrappers in my indifference to survive, and I almost lost her forever. In the audience, many people began to sniffle. Fathers bowed their heads, gripping their children's hands tighter. "That is why I founded this project." George pointed to the large screen behind him. The project logo appeared, a simple drawing, Lily's own, of a house with a chimney emitting a heart shape below it. The title, "Warm Hearts, Warm Kitchens." This project is not a professional cooking school. We are not training 5-star chefs. We provide the space, the ingredients, and the guidance for busy parents to come here on weekends, turn off their phones, and personally prepare a meal for their children. We want to remind everyone, don't let your job turn you into a temporary guest in your own home. The applause erupted again, louder and warmer this time. And for this project to work, I needed someone with the heart of a mother, even if she has never given birth. The person who saved my daughter with a piece of bread and her courage. Please join me in welcoming the project director, Miss Stella. From backstage, Stella emerged. She was no longer wearing a housekeeper's uniform. She wore a simple but elegant business suit, her hair neatly styled, but the gentle smile on her face was unchanged. Stella walked to George's side. She bowed slightly to the audience, visibly moved. Lily let go of her father's hand and rushed to hug Stella. "Aunt Stella." Stella bent down, embracing Lily completely. The image of the three of them standing there, a redeemed businessman, a recovered child, and a kind-hearted young woman, became the most beautiful picture, a powerful symbol of healing. "Thank you, everyone," Stella spoke into the microphone, her voice trembling but full of confidence. Warm hearts. Warm Kitchens is not just a place to cook. It's where we learn to love all over again, because a warm bowl of soup can heal any wound as long as it's seasoned with a parent's presence. The launch event did not conclude with a cocktail party or fancy hors d'oeuvres. George invited everyone down to the massive training kitchen area set up in the adjacent hall. Dozens of cooking stations were prepared. Fresh ingredients were laid out everywhere. George took off his suit jacket, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and put on his familiar bear apron. He stood at a station with Lily. Stella moved between the stations, guiding the other families. "Okay, Lily, what are we making today?" George asked loudly. "Rainbow soup," Lily shouted, holding up a carrot like a torch. The atmosphere in the hall became lively. The clatter of knives, the laughter of children, the sound of fathers awkwardly asking their wives how to turn on the stove. The aroma of onions, meat, and vegetables began to spread, blending together to create a distinctive scent, the smell of family. George looked around. He saw smiles. He saw hugs. He saw children being spoon-fed warm soup by their parents, just as he was doing with Lily. Lily scooped a full bowl of steaming soup. She didn't eat it immediately. She carefully carried the bowl toward a boy her age, standing shyly in the corner, a child invited from a local foster home. "You should eat this. My daddy made it. It's really good." Lily smiled broadly, handing the soup bowl to the boy. The boy took it, tasted it, and then smiled radiantly. George watched the scene, his heart filled with a satisfaction no number in his bank account could provide. He had built hundreds of skyscrapers, but today he had finally finished building a home. The late afternoon sun shone through the tall glass panels of the auditorium, bathing the space in gold, illuminating the plumes of cooking steam. The story of the House of Strangers had closed, making way for thousands of other warm homes being ignited, starting this very day.